Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.
As we quickly approach our Trinity campaign, online Trinity campaign, I thought that we should probably have a conversation about Troupe Style play.
That's when we all join the military, right?
Yeah.
So definitely the first thing is to explain what Troupe Style play is for people.
So Troupe Style play, it was my understanding, was popularized in an older game from Lion Rampart that called Ars Magica.
Oh, okay.
And of course, Ars Magica has had several editions over the years. Lion Rampart used to be Jonathan Tweet and Mark Ronhagen, and both of those names, if they do not sound familiar, should, because they then went on to produce some pretty amazing games, including Vampire the Masquerade and its entire ilk. And then Jonathan Tweet was also involved in, as amongst many amazing projects, was also involved in one of the third edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
So yeah. And it's the idea of Troupe Style play is that there are multiple characters available to play in a particular setting, and what gets played week to week or session to session, I should say, it can be kind of up in the air. Let me give you a good example of Ars Magica, which is again the sort of the place this was sort of invented, or I don't know if anybody had done it before, and I'm sure that it's a improv basis, right, when it comes to like stage and such like that. But the idea for Ars Magica is that you would play a mage. Who doesn't want to play a mage, right? These are these powerful individuals in these covenants that can do amazing things. However, in Ars Magica, unlike say Dungeons and Dragons, your life was in your laboratory, in your sanctum. You spent a lot of time researching how to create spells and understand magic and make magic items and summon creatures and stuff like that, which is not
the opposite of adventuring.
Very conducive.
Yeah.
Exactly. The opposite of adventuring. Yeah. And so Troupe Style play, what it allowed you to do is that every mage did not have to be part of the adventure. In fact, if you look at Ars Magica, it's funny because experience or advancement that you get from being in the sanctum month to month to month is actually far greater than you could ever get going out on adventure. You might like go out and get like 3 XP or something for a whole session, but you're advancing. It's not so much that you're getting more XP in the sanctum, but you're going naturally from like one level to another. So for instance, something that you might do in a month in a sanctum is you might increase one of your scores in your magic art. Well, if you, in a month in the sanctum, you do that, you go from 5 to 6, let's say, whatever that means, in a month. But if you were to actually apply that to experience, it would be like 30 experience, So by and large, mages wanted to stay home. And that was I think a big part, and not something that was really explicit in the rules, but it was from a kind of emergent play where you would create grogs, which were these shields, soldiers for the mages, and you would create companions who were rogues, ostensibly. They were like all different. You might have a politician, you might have a merchant, you might have a thief, you might, whatever the case might be, a sympathetic priest, that are part of the covenant and the people who like go out and get stuff done, And so the players often got to choose, who do we want to send out on this mission? Is this a mission for, for some strange, bizarre reason, we need a flamberge mage and we need to set shit on fire. All right, fine. So he has to go with you, but then the other players may not necessarily have to send their mages. They could play grogs and they could play companions. And then consequently, you don't even necessarily, if you have 3 players as an example, you don't even necessarily have to have 3 characters. You can have multiple characters, which we saw in old school Dungeons and Dragons, where once you started getting into the followers phase of the game, you had a whole fucking entourage, right?
This tension exists a lot. I mean, in the settings of D&D too, and it comes out in a number of ways. I mean, obviously the way with a wizard who would probably be better off studying in their thing, but then they crawl through a dungeon because that's what you do to get XP. But also, even in terms of economics, it's been like a long running joke where it's like you might be better off after you've made your first 1,000 gold pieces to start a business. What are you doing climbing through a dungeon? And it's just kind of hand waved, but only to be able to kind of set that into the actual system itself and make it part of what you're doing explicitly.
Is actually part of the game, is to be like, all right, well, who's doing what, back in town,
right.
Kind of idea. You check that in now, maybe. And not only is, we'll talk about that, but why? Right, so we understand, right? What Troupe Style play is, ostensibly you have a stable of characters, right? And there's a number of reasons why you do this. Ars Magica is, in the outset, seems like an anomaly. In the outset, seems like, well, a mage in his sanctum is kind of a very, very pointed thing, is a very specific reason why you might have multiple people. However, as we pointed out with Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to have followers and things like that. And like you said, maybe we want to start a business. Maybe we want a home base. Torchbearer has base camp rules. In the Lore Master Guide, where it's, you build up on the idea that we're going to set up shop in a dungeon, and if it's a much larger dungeon, and then this is an area that not only we could come back to, but we can attract merchants and craftsmen to the base camp and create a thing. I'd honestly have always wanted to run a game where, I don't know if you're familiar with, I think is Jose Farmer is the name of the author.
I don't think so.
Who did Dungeon World, not to be confused with the Powered by the Apocalypse game. It's just a series of novels about people who were in an endless dungeon. Like, that's the world, Okay. And I've really always wanted to do that with this idea of a war, right? Or just this idea that you not only have front lines, but you also have little towns and like enclaves and organizations, and you can not only visit those things, but and you have this line of scrimmage that you're building, right? So you set up shop here, you go out, you fight, and you come back until eventually you can move the goalpost, and then set up shop.
It also shifts your focus, I think. I mean, or a lot of times anyway, shifts your focus onto that group, whether the group is, like a mercenary company or whatever it is in the fiction. It almost becomes actually it kind of becomes explicit with something like Blades in the Dark, but it's the group becomes almost like a character unto itself,
Yeah. And we see that a lot more going on now, right? With, like you said, Blades and Crew or any Forged in the Dark game often has that. And crews have been well established in gaming for ages. I mean, the reality is that the idea of a party is intrinsic, right? It really wasn't until much later, probably decades into the process, where you were thinking, where games were very specifically thinking of having individual vignettes, right? Where these characters were individual entities, not just part of a cohesive group, you know? The first, I know there's been more. The first I remember was again with Vampire, and the idea that you'd have prequels, right? And you'd have these narratives where you have these multiple storylines that eventually be like, now we're a coterie, you know? But even Vampire, eventually, now you're a coterie.
And that was often a challenge with Vampire in a way, because at least explicitly, like, vampires are kind of like loners and individuals who like don't, I mean, like, there's sort of that political structure that forces them into a group, but it's like almost like being forced. It's almost like under duress. The average vampire wants to hunt alone, doesn't want to be part of, you know, so there's that tension there in the setting. Whereas usually when I was playing in Vampire the Masquerade, it was kind of just like, well, we're a group and like we're starting out this way, so we know each other. And I mean, there would be like the prequel thing where we're kind of tying it together a little bit, but still it's like, you know, there's that tension there. And it's funny that he did, they did Ars Magica and then VTM, because, you know, it's like, it would be really fun to, we were talking about this before offline about like maybe making a Troupe Style, like Blade in the Dark Vampire thing, you know, where you're really focused on your brood, and sort of, you can see that work really well.
Yeah, like little brood war thing, right? I like that idea of like, okay, who's, now it's Predator, and they highlighted that a lot more in Requiem. And you know, I can't say I'm a New World of Darkness big fan, but I think Requiem was definitely the strongest of those lines. And one of the things that they did very interestingly in Requiem is that you had this predatory nature that got sort of clicked on whenever you were near other vampires. They did a very specific thing. Fields like ghouls and things like that could be used in those ways where vampires have followers going out and doing things for them. You know, when we play My Life with Master, we're going to see that the game is actually about the minions. Annalise is a game you're playing the victims of a vampire, and you're building and like painting a picture of who the vampire is based on who their victims are, you know? And so you have this idea where you're looking at an organizational view. Blades nowadays is the biggest example. So when we play Blades, your first inclination, I think, for all of us is, I want to play the same character, right? I want to build the same character. But I think there are reasons, especially games that have one of the big reasons you do this is because of wounds. Now, something in Dungeons and Dragons where it doesn't, you know, it's a snap of the finger, somebody's back to health, because you only have like this medial train, this linear idea of, I have so many points, it's my hit points. As soon as I get back to maximum, then I'm fine. But in a lot of these games, you have wounds, you have something like Burning Wheel or something. There's a number of games where, and I think even a lot of the storyteller and story path games, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It takes a long time to heal.
Yeah.
Well, you can get back in the action and do stuff, right? And still develop character, still develop an idea of the group. And like my most played Ars Magica characters was a Grog, or it was a companion. It was this like woodsman. And I played him more than I actually played a mage when my first Ars Magica campaign I played in. So
Yeah, and there are times when that downtime from wounds can feed into the story, but there are definitely also times where it's like you feel like it limits the options of what kind of stories you can tell if half of your party has to sit in the hospital, So it kind of goes both ways. But there definitely been situations where it's like, this is cool, like this character's injured, now the whole concern is we're in dangerous territory and this one guy is going to take weeks to heal. How are we going to get out of it, or whatever. So yeah, it can go either way,
You certainly see in series, especially, you start to see where side characters and side plots start getting developed. Now, poorly, some people might argue that Lost is a poor example. It's an example, it's just a failed example at the end.
Keep adding things and eventually it's like, how do you tie all this together? Yeah.
I was looking at the picture, right? Season to season to season, that cast just grows exponentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because no one actually dies or leaves, kind of idea.
This is a side note, but definitely there's an important rule to learn about the economy of NPCs and the settings, and whenever you can reuse an NPC you've introduced before to serve a certain function, it's usually better than creating a new one. I mean, it depends, but that's definitely my experience where it feels much more cohesive when it's...
Yeah, there's actually a term for it. It's called conservation of NPCs. It's literally a thing. Yeah.
Otherwise, you get that effect where it's like, oh my God, we've been playing this campaign for 2 years and now we have 4,000 NPCs or whatever.
Well, and the reality ends up being, not only do you not end up engaging with those characters, but a lot of times they just end up becoming pastiches of one another.
Yeah.
Right? They just these same three guys are the same person. Why are these three people the same or different?
Right. Which can be an issue potentially with Troupe Style. So we should get into the pros and cons, I think, of it. One thing we've talked about a lot, I guess offline, I don't know if we talked about it on the show too much, is the idea of player or character ownership. And it's more for some players than others, but immersion kind of deriving partially from your focus on one character and their story, and the concern of if you have 10 characters in a troop or whatever, some of those players might feel like, oh well, I'm not going to be attached to them, so that's one of the potential cons. And I think a lot of times they might be surprised.
There are a good number of people, I think, who really struggle with sometimes getting attached to their character at all, really taking some time to be able to understand who their character is, maybe take many sessions to get in their head and get in a groove. And I can imagine those sorts of players would really struggle being like, well, wait a minute, I have to play 2, 3, 4 other characters, kind of idea.
Right. And sometimes it's that way for me. It depends.
Yeah. I think limiting the scope. So there's we're going to talk about a couple other advantages, but I think limiting the scope can really help with that con, right? Because I think it's a real thing. So for instance, in Ars Magica, you would make a mage, a companion, and a grog. So you really are only dealing with 3 characters. Or with old school D&D, you didn't have to get followers. That was an optional thing. And if you did, that was sort of at not only your behest, but you brought in who you wanted to, right? There wasn't a prescribed way to do it. Even our Blades game, by and large, you played the same characters. But if the narrative took you out for some reason, right, then we had this bevy of people to bring in.
Yeah. In those cases, I assumed it was partially because our groups were so small, but it would be fun to experiment with adding more characters to the group. Yeah.
We used to do a competitive campaign of Street Fighter. And what it would be is you'd have a stable of Street Fighters, and there would be a manager, and there would be trainers and people who would acquire equipment for them, and and logistics people, that kind of deal, depending upon how much money you had in the kitty and how good your fighters got, but there was in the system sometimes this rock, paper, scissors idea of like who should fight who. And you may not, it gave you this breadth of play, right? Because you're playing a character in Street Fighter, but in general, you're playing a character who is like, has a particular set of skills, to quote Liam Neeson. We always played with the idea of like, you could learn more about your opponent by watching them fight, right? So there was like an advantage to switch things up and like, oh no, I'm going to play this really wacky, I don't even remember some of the Street Fighters characters. What was there was a capoeira dude. He was like green and furry. He began with a B, Piranha or something like that.
Right. I forgot their names.
And be like, you play a character like that's very unpredictable, then the advantages people may have gotten from watching your first couple fights then gets, so there's this like interesting, fun dynamic of like, we want to level up other people just in case. We want to, the game that famously does this is Darkest Dungeon, right? Where it's actually disadvantageous to hold on to a character because they get so damaged, they get so messed up over time. You're like, well, do I spend money on this guy or do I just get a new one and start over? Kind of idea. Yeah. So I could certainly see where, that the really investment in your character and immersion, it's harder to be immersed. Those are two separate things, right? It's harder to be immersed if you're thinking big top down, right? If you're thinking more about the crew, if you're thinking about multiple characters' progression and storylines, and then sometimes competing storylines, right? Like the two characters could have competing agendas, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, I played both of those characters. Now, what the fuck do we do, right? I could see where that would be a real challenge. I have a buddy of mine, my dearest and closest friend, who does not like top-down gaming at all, and wants to play one character and get in. This is the individual who, after we played Burning Empires, was like, we could have gotten the same story experience from playing Primetime Adventures, but it was like so much layered on top of it. I just want to play my damn character. Right. I don't want to think about all this other stuff.
Only speak in character and everything first person kind of approach. I remember that being really popular for a while in some of the groups I was playing in the 90s. I got much more into like kind of taking a third person perspective with characters, and I think that helped with this a lot. And that probably also comes from being a writer. I mean, that's why it's like I'm kind of like multiple character arcs and them clashing doesn't seem like a problem to me, but I see how it could be a problem with someone who's, kind of like trying to identify with one character's sort of arc, and if it's conflicting with something else, it's like, no, that's my enemy, or that's the thing I don't want,
I could see another con being that it's related but kind of different is you're often asked, right? And we're going to talk about like failing forward and things like that in a future thing, right? But you're often asked to play towards the character's best interest, right? You're often asked to, most games implicitly ask you to not want to die, to succeed at your goals. And, as we'll talk about later on, you do have some play styles where you're actually working across purposes of your character because you think it's a better story, or whatever the case is. This is certainly a situation that would make that much harder, right? If you're worried about what another character would do, then you're not necessarily playing to your character, and their best interest. Which is kind of interesting because you certainly in like a troop style or a crew game, you would absolutely see, those characters in shows that are like all about the family, that are all about like the crew, that are all about the group.
The Expanse. Since we always use The Expanse as an example.
We always use The Expanse. Or, like Dom in Fast and the Furious. Like, he's all about family, and he's all about like building this idea of crew, right? And like, once you're in his family, well, okay, now we need someone else in the family, right? Or we lose someone, and how do we bring someone in? So there's an interesting juxtaposition there, and I do get how some people would really struggle with that immersive element. But I do find that there's so many really interesting stories you can tell. I've been watching a lot of This Is Us lately, and you have this core family, you have this set of triplets that the ultimately the story is about. Really, this show's about their father, but we're not going to get into that. Right. But then what they do is they just introduce these people. In the beginning, you're like, who the fuck is this person? Like, why did they bring this person in, right? Who is this guy that we're just randomly watching some dude? And then they tie it into the story and how that person ultimately informs the triplets' life, the big three's life, right? Mythic Quest. Mythic Quest is a really pretty well done show, especially early on. And one of the things they did was they introduced a whole session, a whole episode about one of the characters' fathers, parents rather, and like how it molded them later on, that kind of deal. And, that kind of stuff I think can be really powerful narrative tools. And where you bring in other people, and you may not play them all the time, but who they are. Like, it may actually give you more investment into those NPCs if those NPCs are almost PCs. If you could actually play them, if you could get into their lives, that kind of deal. I could see where that has a lot of powerful narrative elements.
Yeah. I think, at least for me and my preferences, I feel like it works best when it's like, either I know why they're a part of the group, or I'm making it, through my interaction, through my playing the character, I'm making them part of the story. When it's like, there's these 4 random characters that you can roll up, that you can play any of them, and they feel kind of replaceable. That's where, for me, I can feel like that, like that style of play can sometimes be harder for me to connect with. Whereas, like, if it's like there's these 4 characters who are part of this story, and I'm going to help make them part of the story, it's more of a reframe. It's not even about what system you're using necessarily. It can be, but an example is like in D&D, before it was even, we thought of it as Troupe Style play. It's like, oh, my character died. My character's name was Rob. Well, here's Rob the Second. Where it's like characters are kind of replaceable in that way, where it's like, yeah, whatever, that's more the risk, I think, for me with it. But I see it being very easy to avoid that sort of problem too, by just not playing that way.
Well, yeah. Just crossing out the person's name and putting a new name up there, right? I think this is certainly more of a struggle for games that have linear progressions, because that's the other big con, is that there are a lot of people who see an opportunity to sit down at the table as an opportunity to advance your character, right? And if you're playing multiple characters, then that character is not advancing and everybody is advancing more slowly.
Right. You can make system things to account for that and make that not a problem, of course, pretty easily. But
yeah, I've actually seen some, and I've been implementing certain things like player experience or player rewards compared to character rewards, is one thing. Having rewards that are a little bit more in-game, and I feel like reward cycles is going to be an episode down the line, but having a number of different ways to reward your characters, not through necessarily XP. And then, of course, we play a lot of games that don't have linear progressions, right? So if you really think about it, playing multiple characters actually allows you to get a lot of different characters up to speed pretty quickly, because getting from that 4 dots to 5 dots, right, is a lot of XP and a lot of gameplay, where it might be more impactful if you have this other character who's still in the getting 2s to 3s phase. You know what I mean?
Systems where it's more costly per dot kind of thing.
It's more costly per dot, but also like you're advancing individual skills or individual abilities and things like that, not necessarily leveling.
With Chronicles, it's flat,
right?
So it depends on what. Because when a system is flat, then it doesn't really matter whether it's a 5 dot or a 1 dot. But
oh, gotcha. Oh, really? It's Chronicles of Darkness. So going from 4 to 5 is the same number of XP.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. God, I should probably look at my own game and see what the case is for Story Path.
I forget with XP and Story Path offhand. Yeah,
it's probably the same. And let's talk a little bit about another different kind of true play and pro. Is you have games baked into it games like DCC and Mutant Dungeon Crawl Classics and Mutant Crawl Classics, where you start in a funnel. You start with multiple characters, and whoever survives the adventure then becomes first level.
Right.
In that game, you don't continue on, but I could see a situation where you'd have a stable of adventurers, right? And an adventurers guild, which I've seen a lot of, right? Adventurers guilds are a good way in Dungeons & Dragons or another fantasy game where you, any kind of organization like that, where now you have a number of characters that are part of that organization that you can pull from. And with Darkest Dungeon, what they do is that you can upgrade the stagecoach, and the stagecoach is what brings in characters. And so when you upgrade the stagecoach, which if you really think about it, applying to an RPG is kind of a really fun and interesting way to have everybody kind of leveling up when you bring new people in, right? So it's like, I'm going to use levels as an example, but obviously we don't all play a lot of games with levels. But like, we got to 5th level, we're going to actually spend whatever currency is involved to upgrade the Adventurers Guild. And now the Adventurers Guild is gonna, when we go there, if we need a cleric because our cleric is out of it or whatever the case is, there's going to be a 5th level, 4th level cleric there, as compared to in the beginning, it was just a bunch of like, first level dudes bumping into each other, but the most effective place I've seen this used is Call of Cthulhu. So when I run Call of Cthulhu campaigns, the way I get around the idea of Call of Cthulhu not being very conducive to character development is to have a stable, and that if someone survives an adventure, then their chronicles carry on, and ostensibly the memory of what happened carries on to that group of investigators, the stable. Elder Goblin was talking about this, where he adds this. I don't know if you remember Glenn Cook's, I think it's Glenn Cook, the Black Company. And Black Company, the idea was that you had a chronicler, and that chronicler's job was to know the past of the company and to carry forward the future of the company, you know?
The story becomes about the company.
Yeah, and Elder Goblin says, like, every game he includes that in a party. Who's going to be the chronicler? What are you going to write? That kind of deal. It's not only a great way to get people invested in the story and to the GM to be not the only one who's writing like all these notes and so forth, but it was also a good way to if someone dies, if a player doesn't show up, right? I mean, we'll get to that next pro, but is a way to have this sort of hardcore continuity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, I mean, it's compensating for one of the like potential cons, but it making it a strength where, like, you know, if the story is more about this company or about this organization, whatever it is, then like the story is a procession of events that are recalled. If they're forgotten, or if no one remembers who died when or whatever, then it's not, you know, it's not a story anymore, right? So that's like kind of the thing. The whole thing is making the story about the company. I mean, you could also, in terms of progression, I think that like there's ways of, you know, I mean, obviously there's ways of leveling up your group and something like Blades, but I think also even like with power balancing characters or whatever, if that's a factor in the game you're playing, the company can be the thing that's leveling up essentially, you know, and then you create a new character within it, you have those resources to draw off of, you know. Yeah.
And so in something like the Street Fighter situation, not only you were leveling stuff up by your fighter, so in every session we had at least one tournament, like two characters going at it, to, you know, an NPC and a PC, sometimes an NPC, a PC and a PC, you know, if that was really, you know, but then you got a prize, right, for doing well in the tournament, and that would then allow you to get some more things and upgrade things and so on and so forth. In Blades in the Dark, you have crew XP, right, where you actually are leveling your crew, we call it leveling, advancing your crew, and getting them various perks and things like that. Most importantly, increasing your tier. So your characters don't really advance dramatically. You get some special abilities, and you get to get a couple extra pips, right, on your skills and such. But if you're tier 1 and you're going against a tier 3 or tier 4 guy, you're going to be at a really serious disadvantage, right? And so crew advancement in Blades becomes a really big deal in allowing you to fight bigger and badder foes.
Sure.
You know, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah. And the scale thing, it's like, on the one hand, when you're looking at it from a gamer's perspective, you know, you're trying to build power just for its own sake, because that's kind of what you want to have. But flipping it around from a narrative perspective, when you build up scale, it's almost like in any story where you're able to increase the scope of what the story is about, you know, where the story starts out like kind of close in. And part of that is just the way the story is written, but like there's a sense of like the character gaining capability and that being tied to that increase of scope. And I think that's kind of a cool thing about how RPGs do it. And sometimes I think it gets lost because people get so fixated on, like, you know, it's all about building power, you know, but why?
Yeah.
You know, like,
I mean, you know, that's what some people dig, and I agree with you, but
yeah, I mean, sure, I'm not saying it's wrong, but like,
right,
you know, like when it actually like allows you to tell a different kind of story, I tend to be a lot more interested. It's like, I like superhero stories, but then you have to focus on the scale of a character who is a superhero. What's interesting to Superman? There's certain stories that resonate better when you have a character like that than ones that aren't going to, you know, like a story about Superman blowing up a tank is, I don't know.
Right. Of course you can. Right. It's not in question. Why are we talking about it? Right. Yeah. And so to spin off of Attrition, not only does it allow you to kind of replace characters very readily and in I think interesting ways, which we'll talk about in a bit when we talk about implementation, but it also gives more gravitas to things like character death, right? Now, you have a party, and if somebody dies, it's like, yeah, they died, but that allows the crew to really participate in that, if you know what I mean. Like if you have all of these people, you can then, if your fellow players are not mourning enough over your character's death, you have a new character that knew that guy, you know, kind of idea. And you could do so. And, you know, so, and I think there's like a legacy involved. There's carrying forward things that quite honestly can be a little trite in some games, like you said, crossing out the name and putting Bob Jr., And so this is a way to like create legacy, to create continuity, to, just build on something bigger than just, one person, and
is it Pendragon that has like generations kind of factored into the play?
Yes. Yeah. That's the next interesting Troupe Style game is something like Pendragon, Heroes Banner, games that have generational play where you're going to play your sons and grandsons, because a session of Pendragon happens over the course of an entire year. So you're like, and of course your life is brutal and short, I'm sure that time you're much as likely to die from dysentery as you are from like sword wounds,
right?
But this idea that like winters pass and then eventually your character dies and now you're going to play the character's son. Well, how cool is that? You don't want to necessarily get into the nitty gritty of consummation, but you certainly, this idea of, oh, wow, I'm courting someone and now I'm marrying them and now I have a kid, and where is that kid going to go? Who are they going to be? You actually have some say in that, kind of I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, me too. And it's another example of taking something that can be trite or kind of like take meaning out of a story and doing the opposite with it. I mean, it becomes very significant, right? And then also the memory of what your previous character did becomes significant. I mean, even if their kid hates them, it still becomes significant just in a different way. But
yeah, I agree. And so 2 things to say about that. First off, Heroes Banner actually does that, where the cycle is much greater and and it's a very deadly game, and the likelihood of you ostensibly playing your children is very, very high, and you're making certain decisions based on legacy, because you might actually make a decision to say, hey, I'm going to fail this, but I'm going to do this epic thing when I fail it that's going to carry my name forward. And like now my kid has to live up to this name, or my kid has to live up to my infamy, kind of idea. So the second thing I want to mention is that we're really talking about this, of course, because the upcoming Trinity game is going to be Troupe Style. So we're going to have a ship, and I'm going to say much like Star Trek, I'm going to reference Star Trek for the game pretty often, because I think it's probably the best model of the type of game that it's going to be, the type of narrative. But something that Star Trek doesn't do well is, because Star Trek's based on the idea that you have these actors, who are the heart of the show, right? There are lots of people on the ship, but you almost never see them, or they're just NPCs.
You get the one lower decks episode or whatever, but yeah, exactly.
Right. Or Barclay, Barclay got a lot of play, you know what I mean? So you get some of the characters who get a few episodes before they died, or whatever the case is. In this case, the idea will be that you'll be given a mission. The players will be basically decide, here's a mission I want to do, of a list of them, a selection of them, or where do we want to go, and then say, who do we think is most appropriate? So, part of the game of the Aberrant Hunters game that we did for Trinity Aeon, the big part of that initial piece was the logistics of who are we going to play, and then consequently, who's going to go down with the away team, kind of idea. And, the idea that Picard goes, well, they changed that, right? Kirk went all the time at every episode, right? But they did change that. At least they had a conversation. At least
they kind of made it a character trait instead of.
They kind of made it a character trait, but at least they had Jonathan Frakes be like, "Sir, you can't go." You know, no one ever told Kirk he was not allowed to go.
Yeah.
And then with the reboot, they did that a little bit more, right? There was a lot more conversation of like, "You can't, you're the captain, you know, I'll go and I'll do this thing." Of course, that never happened. Chris Pine just said, "Fuck it, I'm going to go." Kirk said, "I'm going to go anyway." But there was a little bit of a reluctant hero kind of story there, right, going on. And that's to some degree what I'm looking for, right, in our play, is to say, we don't want the same characters showing up. Yes, they're going to have a pretty good skill set, but they might not have the skill set necessary to accomplish a particular task or whatever the case is, you know. We may not want to bring the gun bunny to a diplomatic mission, you know. That might not be a great idea. Or we might not need the engineer, or we really need the engineer and he hasn't had some airtime, you know. So that's really going to be not only a conversation with a pro, but like the goal of that sort of troupe style play is to bring more characters into the mix, you know.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm interested to see how it goes, for sure. I think it's going to be an interesting experiment.
One more pro that I think we alluded to that we want to talk about, and of course any other cons you can think of, is players not showing up, right? Is if you have a more inconsistent player base, we all know what a nightmare it is to keep some sort of cohesive story. Now, to combat that, I tend to run very episodic adventures. I try to keep them pretty tight. Every once in a blue moon, I don't. Every once in a blue moon, we'll have a little to be continued. But in order to do so and do so effectively, I generally be like, all right, is everybody going to be there to this session? You know? And if they're not, then I have to like now figure out a way to like write the person off or to put them in danger.
Sure. Or something will happen that make them important. Yeah.
Right. But this is going to allow us to not really worry about who plays, right? So I'm not going to, I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to probably have some sort of like registration process set up where every week I'll have like a registration day and then people sign up to play.
Yeah. We have to make a Discord easier to access too. We should talk about that offline a little bit.
Yeah. And I'll probably have a channel for that or something to that effect. I'm very likely going to write like a Discord bot that manages that registration. I do have a Google Sheet that's sort of, going to help me administrate that. And then players get to basically choose whatever characters they want when they get there, right? So I don't care if you don't show up. I mean, I hate to say that, but I want people to show up because they're invested. I want people to show up because but if they don't, it's not that big of a deal because I'm interested how other people play those characters too, or you play different characters. I am going to have incentives. If you played a character the session before, you get first pick to play that character, in the next session, and so on and so forth. There's going to be conversation about that. I'm hoping those conversations are going to be interesting in their own right. But, this is all not only part of troupe style play, that sort of initial conversation, but it's also going to be part of that process. Now, a lot of times these online stream campaigns have the same players that go forward, right? At least for this first season, we don't know if that's going to happen. We don't know what the reception is going to be. I know I have people from different parts of the world. And, I'm I'm going to play every single Friday. So
yeah, I think this approach is really important for it to work on Friday.
Whoever shows up every single Friday, that's just going to play.
So I think Friday's like, I don't think Friday wouldn't work very well as a night for a lot of people if it was like you have to be there every session or, let me know before or whatever. But I think having it open is going to.
Right. And then we're even going a step further and saying that we're going to rotate out GMs. At first, it's going to be you and I. But my goal, my hope would be that if something, God forbid, happens where I can't run something, you can pick up the ball. Mm-hmm. Now, we're generally planning on switching in seasons and stuff like that. But we're paying close enough attention and being part of the process where we can actually hopefully swap out GMs. And, it won't be the exact same experience. That's not what different GMs do, but there'll be certain amounts of continuity and that, more importantly, consistency in the channel, Anything else we want to talk about pros and cons?
I'm usually good at coming up with cons, but I had a few, but I'm not sure if one thing I didn't mention was when we talked beforehand about West March's style play for D&D, and of course the Critical Role is using that right now, so I'm sure it's getting talked about a lot more than it has before, which is one approach to this style of it. But I don't think I think it works really well for D&D. The only downside there is I do wonder, talking about with Critical Role, they have a big enough audience that it's whatever. But if you're trying to create an ongoing narrative with a troupe style play, part of the experiment for me is to see if it creates a narrative or creates a story people want to listen to beyond just people playing in it, because playing in it's a very different experience. And my understanding is they are going to have like a rotating cast. My understanding is that Brendan is going to have like individual sessions with certain people, and then they have group sessions, and then have maybe other group sessions or different people in, and so on and so forth. I think that's pretty cool. I saw a GM, and I apologize, I do not remember who he was. I watched so many, actual play videos. But what he did, and what I'd like to emulate on some level, which I really liked, was he starts every game in the tavern. And so you walk into the tavern, and it's a big tavern with all of the tokens, right, for various characters. And you literally walk in, and first off, you're deciding which of those characters you want to play. And then second off, if you want to hire somebody, you walk up to that person, you have a conversation with them, and so on and so forth. Probably a good half hour, 45 minutes of just starting that whole process. And I don't want to necessarily go that long doing so, but there's some cool role playing going on there. There's some cool opportunities. There's cost analysis going on there, because do we really want it? They said no, they're not going to do it for the money that we want to give them. Do we go on to somebody else? I think there's some really fun conversations there. With the Trinity game, it having a period of time, whether it's downtime or whether it's that, choosing characters section or whatever, where you're focused on the ship. Being within the ship when you're not out on missions is part of the story, and part of the story being about the ship and the group of people who are on that ship, So I think it does become a really important way of gluing that together. If it's just...
Well, I certainly think it would be really cool to be like, okay, so X crew is on a planet. The next session, none of those people are here, or most of those people are not here. And hey, let's have a ship conversation. Something happens on the ship while they're gone, And granted, you could do a thing where you go back and forth, but this actually becomes more cohesive in terms of immersion and so on and so forth, because now we have our own encapsulated story about new characters, but we have a very familiar set of circumstances of an environment that we're playing in. So, it becomes cool, spin-off material.
And those things can affect the story in fun ways. Since we're talking about Star Trek, there's a bunch of TNG episodes that, where there's an away mission, and then something calls the ship away, and then people who are on the planet are like, "Hey, time to go!" And the Enterprise isn't there, So well, and granted, you certainly saw several
series pieces where the main characters went off to do something different, and were ostensibly having their own adventures, and we like sort of cut to them on occasion to talk about. You could see something like Game of Thrones, where in Game of Thrones, of course, the books, each chapter is a character,
it's a point of view character, yeah.
And the characters end up, it's one of the things I liked about the books a lot was that the characters would go off and be in very disparate places, but then cross paths. And when they cross paths, I am certain if I looked online, there's like an interesting timeline of where all the characters meet and where they are as the books progress.
Yeah, I mean, that is one. Those books are definitely like a tapestry. I mean, there's an underlying structure to them that's just crazy. That's one of the things I do appreciate about them.
Who's with Jamie at the time, who's with Arya at the time, yada, yada, yada. And I think that stuff can be a really fun way to weave into a campaign instead of, it really sets a lot of variability, right, into your storyline when you're not just talking about this group of people, the same characters, week after week, just sort of trudging through the marshes. So I saw this, that it was a hex crawl that this guy did this thing where basically, again, I don't think he knew who was going to be there at in a week. And he just started in the tavern every single week and then boop, 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 boop. All right. And then you get to the hex. All right. Where are we going to go from here? Oh, we're going to go here, All right. What happens in that hex? So other games that do this, I think we talked a lot. I've done it with Call of Cthulhu. I think it's pretty intrinsic to something like Street Fighter, right? Or any sort of like wrestling or, stuff like that. I think you could do it with any number of, blades, or any Forge in the Dark is going to focus on that crew, right? Ars Magica is now in its 5th edition, I think. Just did a Kickstarter last year and is being implemented. I haven't checked on it in a while. I'm kind of waiting for it to be done. They're doing kind of a cool thing, if you're into that sort of stuff, where you actually see all of the iterations of the various books getting written. So you can go into a folder and pull an unfinished version of the game.
Interesting.
I'm not particularly interested in that right now. I got too much stuff going on, but when it's finally finished, then they'll give you the whole, all of their backers. But right now you have a link that you can go and like look at how that's panning out. It's a kind of deal. Yeah. Other games. Oh, we talked about DCC already. And Pendragon. I think we covered most of it. I'm not sure we're missing. By all means, we would love to hear if we missed a game, or if you've seen fun ways to apply Troupe Style games, where we want to hear all about it. Implementation. So let's talk about how you're going to make your game a Troupe Style game that maybe we haven't covered. In our conversation here, what do you think? Do you think you talked about how you could see D&D being useful to this? Well, what else?
Like I said, this is one of the many things where we started playing with this style sometimes without calling it a thing or knowing it was even an established thing. And so some of it is definitely just a frame of mind where you're focused more on the story of a particular group, or people on a ship, or people, whatever. I mean, in D&D is one, where it was like literally on a ship, and like on the ocean. As a result of that, certain systems can kind of start to evolve. And that's one approach to it. But I think having a system that's actually built with that in mind and playing with it that way is, definitely something people should do as well.
I think a little pre-planning definitely helps these games.
Yeah, no,
right?
Definitely. Because you're building the structure up more. I mean, you're talking about hex crawls, like, that sort of having a procedural element can certainly help. But if you're trying to make it a narrative game also, you want to, also have that context of like, why are people going from one hex to the other? Is it just, if it's purely gamified just to build up XP or whatever, I think that changes your focus a little bit. You're not making a story about the group. It becomes a different thing. It becomes that's the game.
I'm glad you bring that up because, that's what the podcast is about, is creating story with system, right? We certainly have talked about how various series and ideas have brought that narrative. I'm relatively certain, even without really diving into it, that I'm pretty confident that Critical Role is going to do a really interesting job with that. Who else thinks about that in certain terms is to some degree like Invisible Sun, because Invisible Sun has the developmental scenes where not necessarily Troupe Style, but thinking about things in terms of it's not just the party sort of marching forward together, where you could see where they're going off and kind of doing their own things. And I could see where maybe you might want certain characters to be in on those development scenes that are not your core group,
I just had a thought actually that sometimes, because that's in my experience, which is fairly limited with Invisible Sun, they're so individual stories sometimes that it can be hard to tie them together, and it might be really interesting to play a Troupe Style game in Invisible Sun. I wonder how that would play.
Right, where you have a main character, and this is that character's arc, but then you have characters who are supporting that character, or sometimes even maybe quasi-antagonists to that character. That would be actually pretty interesting. I like that idea a lot. Yeah. For Trinity, what I'm doing is I'm starting with 10 characters. Those 10 characters, I've done this for LARPs as well, where you have 10 characters and they are all interrelated plot lines on some level. Usually through aspirations for our conversations. And then I'll bring in, when you get more players or you develop more of the setting, whatever the case is, I'll bring in 10 more characters. They'll have their own internal stuff, and then they'll also have ties, the two. So now I have 20 characters that people can go on and play, some of which would be characters that, because they played the campaign more often, will have made their own characters, and then I make sure that everybody's sort of tied in, and that gives you scalability, where, let's be honest, we don't know how many people are going to ever be interested in this. And we could have the possibility, if it becomes popular, to be well, let's open up a second game during the week, and it's in the same setting. It might even be on the same ship. We'll have the same conversations, but it's a different group going and doing a different thing. My sort of view or vision of that in the future is the idea that we are a ship and we have to go to different planets, right? Or colonies or whatever the case is. Well, this colony may have a lot going on and might be important to our infrastructure. Let's put a team there and just keep a team there. And that team's story will be about that colony. Maybe they're hunters, maybe, whatever the case they may be. And then you continue having all the stories you were having being on the ship, but now there's a spin-off series about being on the planet, or whatever the case is. So, who knows? It may never get there. Right. But if it does, we have sort of an infrastructure, to do that. So yeah, some organization is involved. Google Sheets is great for this. Some decent note taking. We talked about a chronicler, right? Is probably necessary. Obviously, if you're playing a game that already institutes something like this with Blades in the Dark, then you're ahead of yourself, right? That we started the idea in our Blades game of developing different characters, didn't we? Didn't we have one or two characters in there that people have played as side characters or something like that.
Yeah, a bit. I mean, I like I said, I'd like to experiment with that more. Honestly, we just haven't gotten to it, but
and I definitely want to run ours when ours is fully baked. And again, I haven't checked on it, so if somebody knows that it is, and I just haven't seen it, then by all means chime in. But when ours is finally baked, I really love Ars Magica. I'm not certain if I would use their system or I've always wanted to do a Blades in the Dark port to Ars Magica. But because I think it just lends itself so well. But I want to be fair to Atlas. I love their design crew. I love Ars Magica and what it does. Ars Magica sometimes is a little more fiddly than I think some people are really interested. So
I mean, for me, I think it's also like there's certain games style of system that I engage with easier in in-person games, and if we're doing an online game, sometimes it's it becomes a little easier to do something more like Blades sometimes, where it's fewer moving pieces.
Yeah, 100%. So organization, some sort of infrastructure, consider reward systems, we're going to have a whole conversation about rewards, but consider different ways that people are getting rewarded and maybe separating out player rewards and things that they can do with player rewards compared to character rewards, right? You want to incentivize people coming to the table week after week. You really do. But you also want that character to develop. So you have to sort of like think about how you do those two things without locking someone into a particular character.
Yeah. I mean, that is one thing is if big events happen for a character or whatever, it's like, I mean, how do we want to document? I mean, obviously you don't want to create like a novel to go along with the character, but I mean, like as much as people hate backstories, it might actually be useful to have a backstory for a character that's actually part of an ongoing campaign that you might be jumping into their shoes just to get the notes,
100%. Well, and that's if it happens more organically and is not just
right.
Session 1, here's 13 pages. Then I think I that gives it's like a public medium, right? So one of my hopes, and I don't know if this is interesting at all, guys. I really don't. We'll see. Yeah. But one of my hopes is people are going to like watch the show or listen to the show and be like, oh, we'll be on Twitch. But watch the show and be like, oh, I think it'd be really interesting if this character went in this direction, or I would play that character very differently, or I watched their progression. I know who this person is. I think I could do them justice if the original, actor, so to speak, is not here, right? Kind of idea. I want people to really think about things in those ways. So yes, you would have what's happened in the story so far for that character, but then consequently, hopefully it's a organic ongoing process, not just an initial out of the blue info dump. You would hope, right?
Yeah, I mean, even if it's just like an open, Google Doc, if we can.
yes, or a wiki or something to that effect. Yeah, 100%.
We're talking about backstory, and it's funny because you usually think of backstory of being that level 1 character where it's like in the beginning of time I did like okay first level, but when it becomes sort of
my father's father's father,
when it becomes a recording of memory of that character that's happened in this ongoing story, I think it's interesting. I want the same thing with the chronicler of the group. I was just thinking, like, imagery or so on that goes with a character too can wind up being one of the other ways people can share that. Or like with books, obviously, there are like fandoms who have like everyone's got their own interpretation of what the character looks like, even though they're going off the same descriptions. So that can be a fun thing too, where we'll have different visions of what the character is.
Yeah, I mean that's like an interesting piece of like the investment process. Like I think that's one of the reasons why art is important. Is to have a shared vision, because I think that could be interesting to play with that. Like what do you think your character looked like, kind of idea, and that could be very interesting. I mean, I try to be very representational when it comes to various groups and looks, and that this is not a crew of like everybody looks the same, and everybody shares the same cultural ideals and so on and so forth. That's not really the person I am, So
we're not all tieflings.
Yeah, you're not all tieflings, no. But there's still lies. I just recently heard a comedian who the comedian's last name is Segura, and he goes to somebody and the person says, "Oh, are you Japanese?" And he clearly does not look Japanese, and he's like, "No, I'm Spanish," and he's like. Gets into this conversation. He's like, "Yeah, but you're white." And it's like there's lots of people who speak Spanish, right? Like lots of people who look very different and speak Spanish, that kind of idea. So awesome. So what other ways, we're interested, what other ways have you done, if you've done Troupe Style or you could think of? I want to have more conversations with our audience over some of this stuff. We'd love to hear from you. And let's see how this big experiment goes. And thanks for chatting about it.
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology Podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about, that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.